Hey guys, it's Ashley and welcome to day 4 of my 12 days of BOOKMAS video marathon thing. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about the most disappointing books that I read this year in 2020. All of the books that I'm going to mention here were just simply disappointing. I was expecting one thing out of them or was hoping for one thing, and in the end they just didn't really deliver or live up to that expectation. Anyway, let's get started. So I'm gonna kick it off with the first most disappointing book that I read this entire year because it was one of the first books that I read this year, and that was Infinity Sun by Adam Silvera. So I went into it knowing that it was a story about people with some powers or magic or something like that. It was sort of this fantastical world, or at least it was the real world with fantastical elements to it. And it was mostly a story about brothers. You know, one brother who wants something and the other one who doesn't care for it, but the one who doesn't care for it ends up getting what the other brother wants, and there's sort of a tense relationship between the two ever since then. And if you've been with me for a while, you might know that I really love reading stories about sibling relationships and dynamics. So I went into this hoping for good things, and in the end I just did not enjoy it at all. I had to really push myself to finish it because I truly just did not care about what was going to happen. I did read this quite a while ago, so I'm a bit fuzzy on some of the things that I may have said. You can always check out my January wrap-up if you want to know more details about it. But from what I remember, I wasn't crazy about the writing style. It just didn't really speak to me for some reason. I like a certain writing style when it comes to fantasy, and this was just not it for me. In addition, I remember the story jumped around between characters, and I thought it was only going to switch between Emil and whatever his brother's name was, point of view, and it didn't. It ended up switching between a lot of different perspectives, but at random times throughout the story, it was very odd. We were switching between the two brothers at first, and then midway through the story, we were introduced to this random character's perspective who we had only heard of in passing, and then the next chapter was somebody we'd never heard of, and I'm like, why did you not introduce these characters at the beginning so that we could follow their perspectives? And instead it's just this weird, here's a new character for you, read their perspective, they will be important in a minute. And I think the biggest thing that I wasn't super crazy about when it came to this story was the sort of integration of real world and fantasy. There was a lot of mentions of social media and a lot of social media campaigns and how can we make our image better. That was sort of on top of the fantasy, and it really threw me for a loop. I was not super into the fantasy because of the social media aspect of it, but then I was also not super into the social media aspect of it because I wanted to be into the fantasy, and it was just two completely different things that I don't think meshed well together in this story. Sorry. Let's talk about a book that I just mentioned in a previous video, and that is The Lost Book of the Wight by Cassandra Clare and Wesley Chu. I won't spend too much time on this because, as I mentioned, I did talk about it in a previous video, but I was really sad about this because I loved The Red Scrolls of Magic. I thought that that was such a good book and such a good introduction to Magnus and Alec's story. This story just did not live up to my expectations of what the last one was. This one, it felt like the characters were the only things keeping me from losing track of what was happening. There was the pacing was all over the place and was super slow. The action was not really there, to be honest. There were one or two action scenes that I was yeah about, and the antagonists and the characters in this just didn't make any sense whatsoever. They would just come in at the most random times. It was very repetitive. So I apologize if you enjoy this story. By all means, please enjoy it to your heart's content. I wish that I had, but unfortunately it just wasn't for me. Now let's talk about another one that I read earlier this year, and that is We Are the Wildcats by Siobhan Vivian. This one was one that I actually didn't really have any expectations for going in. I knew that it was about a high school varsity field hockey team and that it took place over 24 hours, I think. But other than that, I really did not know what was going to happen. If you remember or have seen my wrap-up when I talk about this book, it just really did not sit well with me. The main things that I was not the biggest fan of were the gaslighting coach of the hockey team, which throughout the entire story, the girls are constantly trying to make excuses for him. They're trying to justify his behavior. They're trying to effectively put the blame on themselves, which is essentially why he's gaslighting them. And it just was not good to read about. I was just really the entire time had a look like this on my face as I was reading, and it was not fun. In addition, you had all of that build up with the negativity and the gaslighting from the coach, right? And you had all of the girls like believing that they were the reasons that, you know, their team failed last year and all of this stuff. And then in the end, they did have that turnaround where they were like, no, it's not our fault. We're gonna kick him out, like that kind of thing. But the ending and the conclusion and the resolution was literally like 3 pages long, and then the story ended. There was no like resolution to all of the conflict in the story. The scene that ended the entire story, that came right after their realization that this wasn't right, was them walking onto the field hockey, you know, field or whatever, and telling their coach off, and then they went to go play without him. And then that was the end of the book. There was no resolution. It made me so mad because the whole time I had been suffering through this horrible man and what he's doing to these teenage girls, and yet I can't even feel good about their, like, you know, coming to terms with it in the end because there was no end. Yeah, I was not the biggest fan of this story. You know, some books can deal with heavy topics, but I feel like there needs to be some kind of a resolution, some kind of a show that, you know, this is not okay, and we realize this, and we're going to take our lives into our own hands and say, fuck you, you know? Next up on this list, we have We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. This is a story that I've been hearing a lot about for the past couple of years now. It's a thriller, a YA thriller, which I did not expect. I genuinely did not think that this was a thriller, mostly because it's super tiny. This story follows this like rich family and like different cousins and things, and they all go on this island that the grandparents own every summer, I think. But at the beginning of the story, you know that there was this like accident that happened, and throughout the story, as the girl that the accident happened to returns to the island for the summer or whatever, you're trying to figure out what happened and why the kids won't talk about it. I really enjoyed the writing style, actually. It was very weird and made you really believe that you were reading from an unreliable narrator, which you were, but it really like drove that point home. But other than that, I just was not a huge fan of the characters. I wasn't a huge fan of the ending. I will say I didn't see it coming, but for some reason, and like I really cannot pinpoint exactly what it was, this book just didn't capture me in the way that I had hoped it would, especially for being a super short book. I feel like it only has so much time to like grab your attention and really, you know, get you wondering what was happening, and it just didn't do that for me. Like, plain and simple, it just wasn't a book for me, and I have no specific reason for it. I did enjoy the writing style, but other than that, I was just not a huge fan of the story. I'm sorry if this is your favorite book. I'm sorry. I just did not like it. A few more on this list because, like I said, I did read some books this year that I just was not a fan of. Next up is going to be Wicked Fox by Kat Cho, which I read for some readathon. I think it was the Reading Rush. I wanted to like it, and I did in the beginning, and then the story just kind of spun in a weird direction. I can't. This is another one that I just can't really pinpoint exactly why I didn't like it. To be honest, I really couldn't even give you like a synopsis of what this book was about, just because I don't remember it that well to be able to tell you. It has to do with like fox spirits, the Korean mythology where they eat the souls of people is what I think the book was about. And there's this like girl who is a fox spirit, and she ends up moving to this town with her mom and goes to the school and meets this boy, but then there's like this thing that happens and she loses her fox bead that, you know, is her life force or whatever, but then she can't figure out how to put the bead back into her, so she has to work with the boy to figure out what happened and how to do that. I don't know if my head was in a weird place at the time and I was thinking about something else while I was reading it, or whether I just couldn't get fully into the story and fully immersed in it, but for whatever reason, I just did not enjoy my time reading this. Although I did enjoy parts of it, it wasn't my favorite, and therefore it's on this list as at least slightly disappointing to me. The second to last book on this list is House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas, which is the first book in her new adult fantasy series. Not like new adult, I mean like her adult fantasy series that's new. I just realized that could have been kind of confusing. In its most basic terms, the story is about this girl named Bryce who suffers a terrible loss at the beginning of the story and has to cope with her grief throughout the entire thing. She is at some point rounded up into this investigation, and she tries to figure out who did the tragedy, who killed the people. I'm trying not to give spoilers here, even though I'm pretty sure it tells you in the synopsis. So she ends up working with this guy who is an angel, whose name is Hunt, and they have to try to figure out what the heck happened. I feel like I had a certain expectation going into this story just because I have read and enjoyed her other 2 series before. And to be honest, I don't really know what I was hoping that it was going to be. I did enjoy this for the majority of the story, I will say, but there were some points specifically when it came to Hunt that I was just not the biggest fan of. I did like Bryce, and I liked how she was trying to cope with her grief the whole time while also remaining a clear head and trying to figure out what happens to the people that she loved. The world was a little confusing in the beginning. I think I mentioned that like they throw all of this information at you like all at once, and then you're expected to remember it all as the story goes on, and in some cases that works, but in this case it really didn't. Yeah, and there was a specific point of the book that one of the characters sort of took a bit of a turn and like a twist, and I just did not think that it worked well, or at least maybe I like had expectations of what that character was going to do, and because they did that thing, I just didn't really like that. I don't really know what happened, to be honest with you. I did enjoy this book. I would pick up the sequel, but certain things with certain characters I was just not a fan of, and the world itself was a bit confusing, and therefore I didn't fully get myself like immersed in this story. But I am looking forward to the sequel to see if anything changes. And so the final book that I want to talk to you about is one that I recently read and did not really enjoy, and that is Kingdom of the Wicked by Carrie Maniscalco. Scali. I'm honestly not sure what her last name is, but it'll be on the cover when I put it up here. I won't spend too long talking about this because I talked about it in my most recent wrap-up I put up a couple weeks ago. This story is about this girl named Amelia who is a witch, and her twin sister is murdered, and she has to figure out what happened to her. She ends up calling on a prince of hell accidentally and realizes that the entire thing that's happening with these witch murders has to do with them and this like thing and this curse and whatnot, and so she works with him in order to figure out what happened. At certain times in the story, I won't say that it was this entire story, but definitely at certain points, it definitely felt like your stereotypical cliche YA with all of the tropes that we know and sometimes don't like. I was trying to explain this to my sister the other night because when I started seeing people really enjoy this story, I just could not understand what I missed in the story, you know? Like, you know when you don't really enjoy something and then you see everybody else enjoying it and you're like, what happened to me that I could not get into this as much as everybody else did? That's how I feel about this story. I was talking to her and was trying to explain it to her the other night, and the best similarity that I could give for this one scene that happened in the middle. I don't want to give spoilers, but it's the scene where Wrath and Amelia and Anir are having a conversation in possibly it's like a market or something, and they're on their way to do something, right? It's when you like first meet Anir, and that conversation, if you can picture that in your head if you've read this story, that's what I'm talking about. It really reminded me back when I would read Wattpad stories. I can't speak, oh my gosh. The stories where it would be like a weird One Direction fanfic, and it was like your typical, oh, I walked downstairs and my mom had sold me off to get married to Niall Horan or something like that, right? That's what it felt like to me right in that moment, and as soon as I read that scene I was like, okay, I need to stop. But I kept going. I did say I did enjoy certain parts of it. I enjoyed the atmosphere, I enjoyed the whole like magical element to it and stuff like that. It was just certain scenes and the characters and pieces of dialogue and really everything else that I just wasn't a huge fan of. And again, as I mentioned with other books in this video, if this is like your favorite book of all time, just please do not take my comments like offensively or anything like that. I mean you no disrespect, or I mean no disrespect to the authors as well. These books just personally to me were disappointing based on my expectations. So just so we have that cleared up and clear in the air, I think that's all of the books that I wanted to talk about. Again, I wish I had liked these stories more than I did. It might have just been the time of the year that I read them in and what my mindset was, or it might have just been the stories themselves just weren't personally for me. But in the end, these were the books that I did not really enjoy this year, and I am sorry that I didn't enjoy them. If there was one book that you guys tried to read this year that just wasn't for you, definitely let me know down below. Even if it was a book that I recommended or a book that is one of my absolute faves, I don't mind. But yeah, other than that, I think that's everything for this video. If you guys want to follow me on any of my socials, all of my handles are in in the description. Thank you so much for watching day 4 of my 12 days of Bookmas video marathon. I keep having to pause to remember what I called this thing, and I'll catch you later. Bye!